Bin Laden's Legacy, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. The killing of Osama Bin Laden was an important symbolic victory in the struggle against violent religious extremism in the Muslim world. While his death provided many Americans with a feeling of justice served, the strategic impact is less clear. Will the worldview Bin Laden helped shape survive his demise? Or has the newfound sense of empowerment driving the so-called Arab Spring movements in the region undercut an ideology that embraces violence as the only path to political change? Here to explore the evolution of the Al-Qaeda doctrine and its prospects as a political force going forward, we're joined by Ellen Amster, Assistant Professor of History at UWM, whose research interests include political Islam and the intellectual history of the modern Middle East, and Caroline Seymour-Jorn, Associate Professor in UWM's Department of French, Italian, and Comparative Literature, whose teaching and research focuses on Arabic language and literature and the anthropology of the Middle East. Well, welcome both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start, if I could, with a quote from the recently departed Osama Bin Laden. This is from his statement, Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders, from February of 1998. And he says about a fatwa, or religious ruling that he's made, the ruling to kill Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it's possible to do it, in order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy Mosque, Mecca, from their grip, and in order for their armies to move out of all the lands of Islam, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim. This is in accordance with the words of Almighty Allah. Well, so, with that as a jumping off point, what is the context in which this ideology really occurred? I mean, many people would say this certainly has nothing to do with classical, traditional Islamic jurisprudence. I mean, how is this an innovation or an aberration?
I'd say that Al-Qaeda is an outgrowth of one branch of Islamic modernism, and the paradox, if you will, of modernist thought in the Middle East is that the secular governments and Islamism come from the same branch, which was an effort in the late 19th century to modernize Islam by, in fact, an Egyptian jurist, not exclusively, but an Egyptian jurist named Muhammad Abdu. He tried to make a synthesis of Islam and secular law, largely to unite the Islamic world and combat colonialism. And his followers split into two groups. One took this secular path, and one took this so-called Islamist path, in which they said, okay, well, if Islam contains all of secular law, then anything good that you might get from the West is all contained within Islam. And the first of these so-called descendants is Rashid Rida. After him, Hassan al-Banna, who founded the Muslim Brothers. And then the intellectual who really developed the doctrine of the Brothers is Sayyid Qutb. And Qutb wrote, and we can talk more about his ideas, but Qutb wrote Social Justice in Islam, which is that Islam is the answer, not parliamentary government and a liberal system, not Marxist socialism. Islam is the path to social and economic and political justice. And but he said the way to achieve it is to have this cohesion, moral cohesion, social cohesion, and anyone who deviates from that threatens the whole community. And he advocated very, very strong and violent attacks on anyone who would deviate from this view, including the governments, the government of Egypt, both pre and post Nasser. And so what he finally did, Sayyid Qutb, is write a very controversial book called Milestones, in which he actually declared the government of Egypt to be not Islamic at all, pre-Islamic, Jahiliyyah, and that therefore it was fine to attack them. Well, and this is what Bin Laden has. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, but Caroline, that really is an important distinction, is it not? I mean, in traditional Islamic jurisprudence, there's a real discomfort with sort of revolution and overthrowing governments, isn't there?
Well, there is, but I'd like to just get back to something that Ellen has said that I think is very important, in the sense that Osama bin Laden and the ideology that he developed, coming out of thinkers like Sayyid Qutb and others, it shares a larger sort of worldview with other modernists that, talks about, the need to identify what is wrong with contemporary Islamic regimes and how to address that, particularly vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Now, many other modernists, other strands of modernism, would take a very different tack and say, we don't want to engage with violence. We want to actually think about what's going on in the rest of the world in terms of technological development, intellectual development, use that, take that, and develop our own way of thinking and our own sort of structure of society going forward. So in a way, I think you could say that what Osama bin Laden developed was an aberration. I mean, I think I would characterize it largely that way. But he was like other modernists and other reformers in society, in that he did feel free to think about society, to think about government, and to think about how to change and improve things. And that in itself is not against Islamic jurisprudence or, something that's alien to Islamic history and society.
But if his conclusions were, as you say, aberrant, or at least innovative in some sense, let's talk a little bit about what his religious credentials were. I mean,
Zero.
Zero.
Well, I think what's interesting is, returning to your point, is that this declaring your enemies kuffar, right, and de-Islamicizing your enemies, that this is a very extremist, marginal strand within Islamic history, but it does exist even at the very beginnings. The assassination of the fourth rightly guided caliph, or replacement of the prophet, is called a Kharijite. And in many ways, the Islamic world views Osama bin Laden as a modern-day Kharijite, someone who is so extreme in his view. So it isn't. So you're quite right that Islamic governments have been very reluctant to use military force against Muslims. That's been a difficulty.
And one of the other things I think that distinguishes this worldview is the ultimate goal politically. I mean, we hear a lot about the establishment of a worldwide caliphate. I mean, do you think that is a fair characterization of sort of what the ultimate objective was?
It may have been a fantasy on the part of Osama bin Laden. I'm not sure how the extent to which bin Laden or his followers believed that was possible. But I think for the majority of Muslims in the Arabo-Islamic world, the idea of a universal caliphate is not something that's regarded as realistic or necessarily even desirable, right? The other thing that was radical and unacceptable to most Muslims about bin Laden's goals and strategies was his use of violence against civilians. There is a very strong precept that comes out of the Quran which advises Muslims to be very careful in their use of violence in the case of war, even when it comes to defending Muslims and defending Islam. And there is a great deal of caution. There should be a great deal of caution about using violence. So, that was another aspect of bin Laden's ideology that was reprehensible to most Muslims.
Well, and if the goal ultimately is to wash away these corrupt, ostensibly Muslim governments, what one of the interesting strategic elements of his worldview was to say there's the near enemy, these corrupt governments, and the far enemy that enables them, the far enemy being the West generally and particularly the U.S. Mm-hmm. So we haven't seen a great deal of that from other kinds of movements either, right? I mean, where the approach is to attack the U.S. first in furtherance of your ultimate goal of getting rid of whomever you don't like back in the region?
Well, if you look, he published a declaration of war on the United States in 1996 in a London-based newspaper in Arabic. So it's a 6-page declaration. It's quite lengthy. And he's a master of propaganda. So whether he, in a concrete way, thought that it was possible to revive a form of government that was created in 632 AD, this is a topic of discussion, but he was very adept at manipulating aspects of Islamic jurisprudence about legitimate political authority, that the caliph has certain duties to the Islamic polity or the ummah. He has to protect the borders. He has to protect the practice of religion. He has to enforce Islamic law. He has to protect the persons of the Muslims. So Osama bin Laden says, look, throughout the Islamic world, your governments are in the pay of the United States. They oppress their people. They don't do anything about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. There are Muslims killed, Muslims suffering, and your governments are afraid to stand up to the United States. But I, Osama bin Laden, am not afraid, and let me show you how not afraid I am and how powerful I am. So it was a brilliant, in fact, PR coup to destroy the World Trade Towers. And it is, he used so many rhetorical strategies. He was so clever at manipulating different political debates, and this was one of them.
Well, Caroline, we've just got a couple of minutes before our break, but many analysts have said Al-Qaeda has long since ceased to be an organization and is more of an idea. Would you say that that's a fair characterization of where we stand now?
I think so. I mean, certainly if it is the extent to which Al-Qaeda is still an organization, it's loosely structured and obviously has had to go underground, right? That's pretty clear. But I think even as an idea, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden have become increasingly irrelevant over recent years, particularly as the new generation grows up, becomes more exposed to technology, and through the internet is really learning more about the world on a global basis, and is able to, come to their own decisions about the possibilities for their own society in terms of democratization.
Well, and it's a fair question. What sort of this Twitter generation that are on the streets of Cairo and other places think about Osama holed up in his compound without internet access, for example.
Right. Well, I think that what they would say is that, he doesn't matter that much anymore. If he really did matter, I don't think he really did matter that much to the majority of Muslims. Now, there is the fact that Osama bin Laden was able to play off a resentment that exists in the Arabo-Islamic world toward the United States that has to do with U.S. support of autocratic rulers like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and United States support for Israel to the neglect of the Palestinian welfare and the Palestinian concerns. So, Osama bin Laden was able to play off that resentment, and there is a real resentment there. Whether or not people bought into, his methodology and his use of violence, I think people really didn't buy into that.
Well, we can talk a little bit more about the contours of this new movement, the Arab Spring, when we come back. But first, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about Bin Laden's legacy with Ellen Amster and Caroline Seymour-Jorn. Well, before the break, we were talking about sort of the perception among the new generation of people in the streets of Cairo and Tunis and elsewhere, and what the Bin Laden phenomenon really means to them. And I think it's interesting to know what level of buy-in was there ever by the sort of so-called Arab street, and certainly by those young people. You're making the point before the break that he was largely irrelevant.
I think for the vast majority of people, and particularly young people, he was and he is irrelevant. There's been some recent research on Internet use by young people really across the Arabo-Islamic world, which suggests that young people are, having more and more access to the Internet, to Internet news, but also to chat forums where they're really able to correspond with people, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia. And through these forms of communication, young people, from Egypt to Syria and elsewhere, are able to, understand in a more realistic way the nature of different kinds of democracies in the global context. They are, probably becoming less. They are getting a more realistic idea of what's going on in the West, for example. They're able to be critical of elements of societies that they see, outside the Arab world, but also they're able to see the positive elements of, that exist in democracies. And I think, that's what's helping them to form their own vision of, like in Egypt, for example, what young people would like to see as a new democratic form of government in that country.
I actually don't. I don't think that there is a big transformation in how much people know about the West. I think that on the contrary, that this comment that you made about Tariq Ramadan's saying that this is the autumn of U.S. or Western influence in the Middle East is maybe a bit more my view, that the Western democracies were the model of modernity at the turn of the century. There were constitutional revolutions in Egypt, in Turkey, in Iran, in which they rejected Islamic and monarchic systems in order to have Western-style liberal parliamentary government. This is nothing new at all in the Middle East, the idea of democracy. And you had popular revolution just like this. This is Egypt's third revolution. They're on number 3 in 100 years. And then there was and then they find, we don't get the social and economic programs that we want, and a welfare state through this parliamentary government. So there's a turn toward Marxist socialism implemented by these militaries. And then this also under the pressures of the IMF and other World Bank organization and the dictators, these militaries become dictatorships. And there's a reaction against that too. But when the Islamists take power, they don't necessarily create the kind of ideal society that people want. People look at what's going on in Afghanistan and they say, we don't want that. They look at what's happening in Algeria, some of the violence in Algeria, they say, that's also not what we want. So now that things are pulling apart, and there are people from across the political spectrum that cooperate, there is an opportunity to implement a democracy that also brings social justice. People are not convinced by jihadist movements that they are the path to social justice. I think that what this shows is they don't, in fact, see that as the path.
Well, one use of the sort of jihadist movement is on the part of the regimes, is it not? Sort of the foil for these popular uprisings. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, so for example, in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak jailed many Islamists, arguing that they were a threat not only to his own regime, to the safety of people in the country, but to the region. And the sociologist Saadettin Ibrahim, who himself was actually jailed in Egypt under what were probably trumped-up charges, actually managed to do a sociological study of Islamists in prison there and argued that, in his view, many of these people who were jailed were, in fact, although they were very religiously oriented individuals, they were not violent in any way and probably, never should have been jailed. Nevertheless, Hosni Mubarak was able to use the threat of violent Islam as a way to control his population and to really operate a police state.
And we're still seeing that in some of these popular uprisings today, are we not? Yeah. I mean, that's one very easy brush to paint the people in the streets with.
Of course, it is. It's certainly it's been a way in which I think our own government, has been able to justify propping up regimes such as that of Hosni Mubarak.
So let's talk a little bit about what the Arab Spring really does to the Bin Laden Al-Qaeda model of, the only possible hope for political change is the violent overthrow of these regimes. I mean, what does that do to the credibility when you've got something like Tunisia happening?
Well, obviously it's an alternate path, and there's no ambiguity about what the problem is. That this revolution in Tunisia was unleashed by a young man, 20 years old, 21 years old, who had a college degree, could not get a job, had created a makeshift fruit stand to make a living, and the police came and beat him up and threw away the fruit stand. So he set himself on fire in protest. That there is such hopelessness about economic and political future for this youth that they think, we have nothing to lose, I'll stand up to the army. So the end of the welfare state and this long-term political repression, that is like you say, people are seeing that they do not need Al-Qaeda in order to remove the state.
Well, and it's interesting, and one of the ostensible goals of a high-profile terrorist attack like 9/11 was to sort of spark this revolution across the Arab world, and that really never happened. But it's interesting that the events in Tunisia that you're describing actually did have that effect, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the other thing that's really more relevant in some ways to our discussion is, I think that Osama bin Laden's movement really has become irrelevant, but there is a new Islamic modernism or a new Middle Eastern or Arabo-Islamic modernism that is emerging in the region. And I think we need to really pay close attention and watch what happens there. It will involve, I think, some level of interest in religion. There is, going on in the region what Laura Deeb calls a piety movement. Laura Deeb and others have named it this. A return to religion that does not necessarily argue that Islam somehow has to guide politics in any really direct way, but that people can return to their religion, return to their identity in a personal way, in a way that they shape their own lives, their own space, their own behavior and comportment, without any sort of resonance of political control or violence.
So what does this paradigm shift you're describing mean for U.S. policy towards the region?
Well, I think that the U.S., as you mentioned, has been hysterical any time that there's a mention of Islamists, because for them, Islamists are Sayyid Qutb of the 1960s. And what's kind of happened, it's not like a future, it's happening already, is that there are aspects, though, of this idea of social justice in Islam, that there are ways to use Islam to create a social justice, but within a parliamentary governmental model. So, for example, the president of Turkey is from the Islamist party. That, we wonder, okay, what is this Islamism? Is it fascism? Is it communism? What is it? We look for the historical analogy. And in some ways it's a little bit like socialism. Marxist socialism was revolutionary, but it became moderated in Europe, and it became political parties that have some elements of the socialist idea, but which accept a liberal parliamentary government. And the same thing is happening across the Middle East, that now Islamist politics are a great spectrum. They're different aspects of introducing Islamic values to economics, to social welfare policy, to health, to political authority. It's a mode of politics as opposed to one ideology. And I think that this is something that the United States is recognizing. I think the government is more skeptical of Gaddafi saying that, it's the Islamists, Al-Qaeda, that is opposing him or something, that they've called his bluff now, I think.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it at that. So, bottom line, in 30 seconds or less, when you're teaching years to come about the events around Bin Laden, what is his legacy?
Well, as we've already said, I think that although he was able to, undertake this really violent terrorist mission, ultimately it's not going to have any long-lasting sort of impact on Islamic ideology.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. Ellen Amster, Caroline Seymour-Jorn, thank you very much. To our viewers, see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220, or visit us at our website,